Good evening, Lakes Free. It's good to have you guys joining us tonight as we begin our series in the Gospel of Mark. We've titled the series Sovereign and Servant because they're really focusing on the major themes that are happening in the Gospel. I think it'll be a good time. Thank you for all of you maybe who aren't a part of Lakes Free for joining us tonight. I think this will be a fun ride. So let's go ahead and just to kind of start it off, since we are doing this on Facebook Live, and I think this is on YouTube and whatever else we're airing on right now, please feel free to interact. The more interaction we have, the more comments, the more questions, the more whatever, the more fun this will end up being. So please feel free to interact at any point in time. But let's begin with a word of prayer. Father, we just thank you so much for this time. We thank you for this opportunity to spend time in your word. Father, to just see the beauty and the glory of your Son. Father, I pray that you would guide this study, that your Spirit would be working in our hearts, opening our eyes so that we might see the wondrous things in your law, Father, and causing our hearts just to adore you. Father, please work powerfully. We pray this through your Son and by your Spirit. Amen. All right, so beginning then with the Gospel of Mark. As we open up, we're not going to make it too far tonight. We're going to focus primarily kind of on an introduction. I think introductions are especially important because the more we understand about the background, the more we understand about who Mark is and the context that he's writing in, the more we can genuinely appreciate what he's saying to us. It's kind of like if you're conversing with your wife, if you're conversing with someone that you know really well, right? Their words, the things that they communicate to you just have more meaning. Knowing who these people are helps us to interpret what it is they're trying to communicate to us. Whether or not something they say might be offensive or unoffensive can make all the world of difference depending on who that person is. So we're going to begin tonight by kind of discussing some basic kind of introductory questions. So as we look at the Gospel according to Mark, we're going to begin actually with the title, the Gospel according to Mark. Who is Mark? What is a gospel? What does it mean to be a gospel according to Mark? Well, to begin then, who is Mark? Who is it that's written this book for us? In general, John Mark is kind of his fuller name. The first time we actually see him is in Acts chapter 12, verse 12. If you have your Bible, feel free to open up Acts chapter 12, verse 12. So in this context, Peter had actually been in prison. We'll kind of pick it up in verse 11. When Peter came to himself, he said, "Now I am sure that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting." When he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. So this is the first mention that we have in the scriptures of John Mark, of our figure who then wrote this gospel. So we know that he's the son of Mary. This isn't to be confused with Mary, the mother of Jesus. This is a different Mary. Mary was a very common name back then. So he's the son of Mary. This is a Christian household, right? This is a place where people are gathered together, where they're praying together, okay? And not only that, but this is a household that's well known to Peter. So Peter is intimately involved in this household. So that's a little bit of background on John Mark. What else can we say about him? Well, Colossians chapter 4, the end of Colossians tells us that Mark is actually the cousin of Barnabas, which if many of you have done much studying in the New Testament, then you know Barnabas, especially from the book of Acts. He's a prolific missionary in the book of Acts who traveled around with Paul and such. Also, Acts 13 tells us a little more about John Mark. So Acts 13 records the very first missionary trip, the very first mission trip that Paul and Barnabas went on together. So as they went out, well, let's go ahead and look at it. Acts 13. Acts 13, as they go out, it kind of just mentions the two of them at first. But as they go along visiting places, we find out eventually that there's actually a third member of their party. Scrolling down to chapter 13, verse 13. Now Paul and his companions set sail from Paphos and came to Perga and Pamphylia. And John left them and returned to Jerusalem. This John is the same John Mark. So John Mark had actually been with them doing missionary work. And now he was departing from them, and everything seems fine. Well, that is until we move forward a couple of chapters to Acts chapter 15, close to the end of Acts chapter 15. As they prepare to go on their second missionary journey, it's Paul and Barnabas. As they prepare to go, John Mark wants to accompany them again. Well, this actually ends up causing a division between Paul and Barnabas because they have disagreements about whether or not it's appropriate to have John Mark with them after their previous experience. So the two actually end up dividing and going their own directions. Mark ends up going with Barnabas. So that's a little more. So we see this little bit of tension then, not just between Barnabas and Paul, but also between John Mark and Paul. Fast forward a little bit more, and we find that there's actually reconciliation between them. Going back to Colossians chapter 4, Paul actually writes to the people of Colossae, preparing them for John Mark's coming to them, just to assure them that everything is good. He does the same also in the book of Philemon. And then actually, even maybe more significantly, in 2 Timothy, we see that John Mark is one of the people right there at the end of Paul's life, at the end of everything, right? He in 2 Timothy, at this point in time, Paul is looking forward to what he's convinced is going to be his death. At that point, he actually requests that John Mark come to see him. So there's been reconciliation between the two. So that's a little more about him. Interestingly enough, we mentioned previously that Peter was actually quite close to him. Well, Peter actually writes in 1 Peter 5:13. In 1 Peter 5:13, Peter actually refers to Mark as being like a son to him. So there's just an incredibly intimate relationship. So as we look at all these passages in the New Testament, as we explore this, kind of the picture that we walk away with is here's this figure who is significantly intertwined with all of these other characters throughout the New Testament, all these other significant players throughout the New Testament. You have Peter, you have Paul, you have Barnabas, you have all of these characters, and he's kind of right at the center of it all, right? And not only that, but he has a significant ministry of his own, traveling the world, sharing Christ, coming and providing relief for Paul. So he ends up being a very significant figure in early church history. So that's a little bit of background on who he is. But that goes on to raise the question, what about his writing? And what about the process? How does this Mark end up, which he might have been there actually in his gospel, potentially. He's unnamed if he is. But how did this Mark go on to write a gospel, right? Go on to write a gospel about Mark. Well, the early church actually helps us with this. The early church helps to identify that the Gospel of Mark actually comes largely from Peter's own testimony, right? So in some respects, the Gospel of Mark is actually kind of the gospel according to Peter himself. In fact, it's been noted that that what you see when you look at the Gospel of Mark actually very much reflects the gospel proclamation that you see coming from the lips of Peter in Acts chapter 10, verses 36 to 41. There's just a strong similarity between his preaching and what you see there. Interestingly enough, so church tradition then strongly identifies Mark with Peter, and a lot of Mark's gospel actually came out of being discipled by Peter, about his relationship with Peter, especially in Peter's last days. So some other funny elements actually come from church history as well in that regard. So some of our early documents tell us that apparently Mark had very awkward hands. He had very proportionately small hands compared to his size. Stubby fingers is the way he's referred to. So it's kind of a sad thing for us to remember about Mark, but so you never know for sure what's going to stick the way people remember you. So that's a little bit of the background then behind Mark and behind his writing and the process that he went through, and kind of how the Gospel of Mark then ended up coming to us. Well, that raises the question then, when would that have been written? Well, it's hard to say for sure, because it's not like when you open the book of Mark, it's not like there's a date right there stamped on it, right? So it's not always easy. I mean, really, hypothetically, there's a broad range that the gospel could have been written in, and consequently, there's a broad variety of theories out there on when it actually came around. So ultimately, we can't say for sure, but there are some things we can do to maybe help narrow it down a little bit. One thing we feel fairly confident about is that it was probably written after Paul's letters. Now, that might actually be surprising for some of you. Sometimes we get the idea that as we pick up our New Testament, it's in chronological order of the books. So that means, well, Matthew's at the beginning of my New Testament. So that means Matthew must have been written first, right? And then Mark was probably written after that. And then of course, Paul's letters came after the Gospels and Revelation, because that's the very end of the New Testament. That would be the last one written of all. That's probably not the case, though. Well, it's definitely not the case. The New Testament isn't arranged according to when it was written. Really, probably some of Paul's letters are some of the earliest books to be written in the New Testament. So Mark's gospel probably came later than that. There's a lot of consensus, not complete consensus, but there is a lot of consensus that it was likely the first gospel written. Again, there's some differences of opinion on that, and that actually, as Matthew and Luke wrote, there's a lot of evidence that points to maybe they actually utilized Mark in writing. So that being the case, Mark would have to, again, if that's the case, Mark would have to precede that. But then there's also, again, as I've already mentioned, there's the dependence on Peter. There's a dependence on him. So it can't be too late. We have quite a bit of evidence to show that Peter probably died under Nero's persecution around AD 64. So at least that gives us kind of a terminus date where, well, it could actually be written after that date, but again, for him to be influenced, he was at least well acquainted with Peter at that point in time, right? So he could have written after his death, certainly, but again, we want to maintain that there's probably a dependence upon him. My own personal guess, and again, there's just a broad range. I would tend to put the Gospel of Mark somewhere around the death of Peter, whether maybe just a little bit before or maybe just a little bit after. There's a lot of tradition that points to him probably having written in Rome, so that timing would line up. But again, we can't say for sure. And just to remind you guys again, if you do have any questions about that, please feel free to ask. Don't hesitate. I know this is a different media. I'm used to teaching in a classroom where I can call on you and say, hey, how do you feel about this? And ask you more specific questions. And obviously, this type of format doesn't really allow for that as much. So please feel free to chime in with anything. Well, maybe not anything, but something somewhat pertinent. So where did he probably write this from? Well, assuming that he actually did write somewhere around the death of Peter, it's very likely that he actually wrote this in Rome. Rome, again, that's where both Peter and Paul would have been in prison. We already saw back in 2 Timothy that Paul had actually encouraged John Mark to come and visit him. So again, we have some degree of confidence that John Mark probably followed through in that. And again, there's a lot of church history that actually puts him in Rome. Many ancient documents point to that. So it's very likely. And then on top of that, there's also just some internal elements as we read through the Gospel of Mark that I'll try to point out to you. But just some things like when Mark mentions things that a Jewish audience would be familiar with, he feels the need to explain it. There would be no need to if he was writing to a Jewish audience. It would only make sense if he's writing to a Latin or to a Roman audience. And then there's other things. So he unpacks some of those expressions. But on the other hand, he uses a lot of Latin expressions, which would be, at least at that point in time, a little bit uncommon unless you're in a major Roman city like Rome. So there are internal elements to the book that also point to being written in Rome. And again, church history largely agrees with this. So all that, put those things together, it seems very likely that Mark wrote either just before Nero and his persecution of the Christian church, or maybe right around that time period, potentially a little bit after, but somewhere in that general window. Either way, either way, the politics of Rome and the things that are going on there in the city are certainly having an effect on Mark at this point in time. I mean, either way, this is significant as we read through this book. Tacitus, a Roman historian, when he writes about Nero and the persecution that happened under him, he talks. If you're not familiar, the way it kind of begins is Rome, the city, basically burns. Half of it burns down, totally decimated. Now Nero takes advantage of this and ends up building a huge palace in that area that was burned. So a lot of people, a lot of Romans looked at Nero's actions and they said, "You just did that to be self-serving. You're the one who set the fire. You're the one who actually caused this to happen." Well, Nero responds to that by actually accusing others. He accused, of course, the Christians, and that started the Neronian persecution of the church. Again, that would have started about AD 64. Typically, we tend to believe that's when Peter died, and that's probably when Paul died as well. Now, Tacitus, when he writes about this, when he tells us about what the Neronian persecution is like, he talks about they would take Christians and they would put animal skins under them, or animal skins on top of them, and actually feed them to other animals. Right? There's one testimony that talks about crucifying Christians, just in mass droves, just killing them, slaughtering them. And then there was another thing that Tacitus wrote that talked about how they would actually use Christians to basically as human lamps. They would burn them, and they would use that to light their city by night. So that's kind of what rolled out under Nero. At this point in time, the church had faced other forms of persecution and ostracism and judgment, but they hadn't faced anything like this. So this was a significant turn in the way that the city and the state was dealing with Christians. And so here's Mark. Mark is ministering to the Christian people in the midst of this. So when he wrote, he was writing probably largely to Christians in an effort to encourage them, in an effort to bring them comfort and to bring them peace. Okay. The genre is always important. When I say genre, I mean what type of writing, what type of literature is this, right? I mean, we all know that if we hit the end of the story and someone says, "and they all lived happily ever after," I mean, we all know that we just got through talking about a fairy tale, right? And it's important to know that that fairy tale is actually talking about a fairy tale, because we don't want to interpret it like it's history, or we don't want to interpret it like it's modern day news. We need to recognize that this is a fairy tale. It's a made up thing. It's a made up story. Genre is hugely important for how we interpret the things that we read. So as we read this gospel, then we need to recognize what it means for it to be a gospel. The gospels were a bit unique and they're a little bit different. So, I mean, in general, I think most people would look at a gospel and say, well, I mean, it's basically just a biography, right? And that's not too far off. It is. It is very similar to our modern day biographies, but there's differences too, right? Because our modern day biography tends to be very focused on including all of a person's life, including especially significant things that happened early on in their life, talking about their home life, talking about the events in childhood that helped establish who they would become. Events like that are important in modern day biographies. But when we look at the Gospel of Mark, that's not what we see. And in fact, when we look at the Gospel of Matthew, when we look at the Gospel of Luke, when we look at the Gospel of John, that's not the picture that we get. Rather, instead, we get a picture of someone who's writing with a very different purpose, which is why as we read through the Gospel of Mark, you're not going to see a whole lot. In fact, well, in the Gospel of Mark, you're not going to see anything dealing with Jesus's childhood, because that wasn't Mark's purpose, right? When we look at the Gospels, they're giving us a selective account. It's a selective account. They're giving us pieces that they feel like are important to establishing a certain argument, a certain claim. If you're familiar with reading Paul's letters, when you're reading Paul's letters, it's like reading an argument, right? Paul is trying to prove his case about something. He's trying to tell us about what justification is, or to tell us about salvation by grace through faith, or tell us about something like that. And so he strings paragraphs together to create an argument. Well, it's kind of similar with the gospel, but instead of stringing paragraphs together in a gospel, they're putting together these little short narratives telling us about different events and telling us different teachings from the life of Christ, because they're putting together a larger picture of who Christ is. So they're selective in what they do. Another thing is, it's not always chronological. It's not always chronological, which could be confusing for you. So if you read the Gospel of John and then you read the Gospel of Mark, you could be confused about the order of things. But that's okay. They're not trying to present necessarily a chronological account of the way everything happened. There's some general chronology. When we begin the Gospel of Mark, we're beginning at the ministry of Jesus. And then at the end of it, we get to the end of his ministry. So there's some basic chronology there, but it's not going to be that way from event to event. There's going to be variety. So they are telling us about the life of Christ, just like we would expect, but they have a slightly different purpose. And even then, each gospel is going to provide a slightly different purpose and a slightly different picture of who Jesus is, which is one of the reasons why we need 4 gospels. You know, sometimes Christians just want to collapse all 4 gospels into a singular story and say, why do we need 4? Let's just put them together in one. Make it simpler that way. Well, because we would lose the rich texture. We would lose the mosaic quality of the gospels if we were to do that. Each of them serves a unique purpose, because one gospel couldn't possibly do what the 4 gospels do. One gospel would never be able to put it together in such a beautiful and ornate way as the 4 gospels do. So we need all 4. And in that regard, Mark plays a significant role. You know, there are points in church history where Mark actually receives a lot less attention and a lot less focus, because people saw Matthew as being more important. They saw Luke as being more important, or John. And especially because Mark is the shortest of the Gospels, it was easy to give Mark short shrift. But Mark gives us a beautiful picture that I'm excited to delve into with you guys. All right, let's move on from some of that background, and we're not going to make it far tonight, but that's okay. I planned to not make it very far tonight. But let's just look at verse 1. Okay, verse 1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So it's kind of cool. The beginning, the Greek word there is arche. So that's actually the same way that your Greek translation of your Old Testament begins, right? In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with. Nope, sorry, that's John. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So that's the same way. So it's probably a very intentional allusion that Mark is doing here, saying that, look, just like that was the beginning of all of creation back in Genesis 1:1, God is doing something new. God is doing a new creation. God is doing a new significant event to create all things new. It's probably a very intentional allusion. All right. In the beginning, the gospel, in the beginning of the gospel. So gospel is used in different ways. In Greco-Roman times, gospel was regularly used to describe a conquering general, or to describe a king or a new king or a new emperor. The gospel was the good news of the proclamation that they had a new emperor, a new king, or that the general had won, or whatever. So it was a very political term. The Jews, prior to all of this, back in Isaiah, they actually used it in a slightly different way. Isaiah 52, verse 7 uses the same word, uses gospel as kind of pointing to an end time restoration that God's people have been waiting for, an end time rejuvenation, restoration of all things, fulfillment of all the promises that God had made to his people. So his people have been waiting for this gospel to come. And here it is. It's arriving in Mark chapter 1. The gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, Christ isn't a last name for Jesus here. Christ is actually a title. Christ is the Greek translation of the Hebrew word Messiah. This was the long-awaited Messiah, the king, the descendant of David who was going to come, who would usher in God's kingdom. Again, restoration of all things. This is significant for Mark. That God is doing something new. God is bringing all things to completion and to closure. That's who this Messiah is. And then it goes on to tell us that he is the Son of God. Son of God. Now, sometimes this can trip people up a little bit. Sometimes when we hear Son of God, our immediate instinct is to think the second person of the Trinity. And that is true. That is who the Son of God is. But that's not the way the biblical authors or the New Testament authors always use that expression. So especially as you read the Gospel of John, John especially is going to emphasize that point. And Mark will kind of come back around to it and tease it a little bit. But there's another way it can be used also. As we look at the Old Testament, Son of God is an expression that's used in 2 Samuel 7:14 in reference to the future Davidic heir who would be the Messiah, who would be the king. So Son of God can also refer to this kingly fulfillment of all of God's promises. And I think that's what Mark means when he uses it here. So that's the reason why he links Messiah and Son of God so closely here, or Christ and Son of God so closely. This is the main point. This is the main point of Mark's gospel. This is the main point. All of the gospels focus on Jesus and what it means for him to be the Messiah. But Mark's unique focus is on the juxtaposition of Christ's kingship and his suffering. He puts these two realities together in a way